Picture this. You're a Spanish conquistador standing in the great plaza of Tenochtitlan in the year 1519. The city stretches before you like nothing you've ever imagined, with towering pyramids that seem to scrape the heavens and canals filled with colorful boats carrying exotic goods. But as you explore deeper into this magnificent civilization, you begin to witness ceremonies and practices that will haunt your nightmares for the rest of your life. What you're about to discover isn't some sensationalized tale spun by European propagandists seeking to justify conquest. This comes directly from Aztec codices, archaeological evidence, and first-hand accounts from indigenous sources who documented these practices themselves. The evidence is so disturbing that many historians have chosen to focus on Aztec architectural achievements and military prowess, rather than confront the systematic sexual exploitation that operated at the very heart of their empire. But the truth has a way of emerging from the shadows, doesn't it? And the truth about Aztec sexual practices reveals something far more sinister than isolated incidents of ritual excess or cultural misunderstandings. We're talking about institutionalized systems that transformed human intimacy into a weapon of religious control, practices so methodically organized that they shaped the lives of millions across Mesoamerica for centuries. The Aztec Empire wasn't just another ancient kingdom building monuments and conquering neighbors. It was a theocratic superpower that controlled vast trade networks, commanded tribute from dozens of subject peoples, and possessed something that made all of this possible: a religious infrastructure built on sexual exploitation, so sophisticated and so deeply embedded in every aspect of imperial governance that it became virtually invisible to those who participated in it. Now, before we venture deeper into this dark chapter of human history, I need you to understand something crucial. What we're about to explore isn't about attacking modern Mexico or condemning indigenous cultures. This is about documenting historical practices that were recorded by the perpetrators themselves in stone codices and temple carvings that still exist today. Practices that reveal how religious authority can corrupt the most fundamental aspects of human experience when combined with absolute power. The Aztecs kept meticulous records of everything: religious ceremonies, tribute collections, military campaigns, and yes, even the systematic exploitation of human sexuality for divine purposes. These documents survive in museums and archives across the world, carved in stone and painted on bark paper by scribes who viewed these practices as sacred duties rather than atrocities. Archaeological evidence continues to emerge from excavation sites throughout central Mexico. Temple complexes with architectural features designed specifically for sexual rituals, burial chambers containing remains that tell horrific stories, and ceremonial objects whose purposes become clear only when examined alongside the written records. History doesn't disappear simply because it makes us uncomfortable. So, what exactly are we talking about here? We're talking about practices that went far beyond the typical brutalities of ancient warfare, or the standard religious sacrifices that most people associate with Aztec culture. The Aztecs created something unprecedented in the Americas, a theocratic system that weaponized human sexuality as a tool of divine communion, more powerful than any military conquest. They developed elaborate rituals for the mass procurement of victims, industrial-scale ceremonies that consumed hundreds of people at once, and systematic breeding programs designed to produce human beings for specific religious purposes. But here's what makes this story particularly chilling. These weren't the desperate measures of a struggling civilization or the temporary madness of wartime excess. These were core religious practices that persisted for centuries, celebrated in poetry, justified by elaborate theological frameworks, and documented with pride by the empire's own priests and scribes. They saw nothing shameful in their actions because they lived in a society that had completely normalized the sexual exploitation of captive populations as necessary communication with their gods. The scope of what we're about to uncover is staggering. We're talking about practices that affected millions of people across generations throughout Mesoamerica, children torn from their families and subjected to conditioning so complete that they begged for the privilege of participating in their own destruction. Women reduced to sacred vessels in ceremonies that operated like religious assembly lines. Men mutilated in procedures so brutal that survival was considered a divine miracle, and all of this happening not in hidden chambers or secret locations, but as the central focus of public festivals that entire cities gathered to witness. The most disturbing aspect isn't just the scale of the suffering, though that was certainly enormous. It's how these practices were systematically designed to merge sexuality with divine worship, creating a religious system where the most intimate aspects of human experience became public offerings to bloodthirsty gods. The empire created environments where natural human bonds were severed in the name of religious duty, where love was corrupted into ritualistic performance, where intimacy became a form of sacrifice rather than connection. Think about the psychological impact for a moment. Imagine growing up in a society where sexual violence was not only visible on every major religious holiday, but celebrated as the highest form of spiritual devotion, where children learned that bodies could be offered to the gods like any other form of tribute, where entire generations were raised to see sexual brutality not as aberrant behavior, but as the most sacred act a human being could perform. The empire's educational system reinforced these attitudes through religious instruction that portrayed sexual sacrifice as divinely mandated, the only path to cosmic harmony. The economic incentives underlying these practices reveal just how deeply sexual exploitation was embedded in the empire's foundation. The ritual calendar wasn't just a religious schedule or a cultural tradition. It was an economic engine that generated the human resources needed to maintain divine favor, funding military campaigns, agricultural cycles, and administrative operations through elaborate systems of tribute that included human beings specifically selected for sexual purposes. Trade routes were established to facilitate the exchange of ritual victims. Diplomatic agreements included clauses governing the supply of appropriate candidates for ceremonies. Military strategies incorporated calculations about how many captives could be processed during the next festival season. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this entire system was how it created a culture where exploitation seemed not only normal, but spiritually necessary. The empire had perfected the art of making victims grateful for their selection, of convincing captured populations that their suffering was actually a form of divine elevation that would benefit their families and communities for generations. They developed theological frameworks that transformed rape into religious communion and sexual slavery into sacred service. The international response to these practices reveals how thoroughly the Aztec system influenced diplomatic relations throughout Mesoamerica. Neighboring kingdoms that might have resisted were too dependent on Aztec trade networks and military protection to risk divine displeasure over the fate of ritual victims. The influence of Aztec sexual customs spread far beyond the empire's political borders, as subject peoples and trading partners adopted these practices, viewing them as sophisticated approaches to divine communication. Client states began implementing their own versions of Aztec sexual rituals, spreading the empire's particular brand of religious exploitation across vast regions of Mesoamerica. The systematic weaponization of sexuality became a model that other powers emulated, creating a network of interconnected civilizations bound together by shared traditions of ritualized abuse. What makes this history particularly relevant today is how these practices didn't simply disappear when Spanish conquest finally shattered the empire. They evolved, adapted, and found new expressions in colonial and post-colonial societies. The infrastructure of sexual exploitation that had operated for centuries left deep cultural wounds that influenced attitudes toward power, sexuality, and religious authority long after the great temples were demolished and the codices burned. As we prepare to examine the specific mechanisms of Aztec sexual exploitation, I want you to keep something in mind. Every ritual we'll discuss involved real human beings. Every ceremony will analyze destroyed actual lives. Every practice we'll document left scars that extended across generations and shaped the psychological landscape of entire populations. The numbers are important because they reveal the scope of the suffering, but behind each statistic was someone's child, someone's spouse, someone's hope for a future that would never come. The story we're about to tell spans several centuries and encompasses millions of victims across the Aztec Empire and its sphere of influence. It involves thousands of priests and administrators who implemented these systems with bureaucratic efficiency, revealing how religious authority can be weaponized to justify the most brutal forms of exploitation. It shows us how entire civilizations can be built on foundations of institutionalized violence disguised as divine mandate. These aren't comfortable truths, but they are necessary ones. The documentation exists in stone and bark paper. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. The voices of the victims, preserved in the very codices that celebrated their destruction, demand to be heard, and their suffering demands to be acknowledged. Only by facing this history honestly can we begin to understand how human beings are capable of such systematic cruelty when they convince themselves that their actions serve a higher purpose. Only by examining these patterns can we recognize how religious institutions can become instruments of oppression when they operate without moral constraints or external accountability. The practice that formed the cornerstone of Aztec sexual exploitation was something they called the Flower Wars. But these weren't the limited conflicts between neighboring city-states that most historians describe. They were systematic harvesting operations designed to acquire specific types of human beings for religious purposes that went far beyond simple sacrifice. Imagine Aztec military commanders planning campaigns not around territorial conquest or resource acquisition, but around the procurement of beautiful young people whose physical characteristics matched the requirements of upcoming religious festivals. They maintained detailed intelligence networks that monitored populations throughout Mesoamerica, identifying communities that produced individuals suitable for their ceremonial needs. The selection criteria were precise and disturbing. Aztec priests developed elaborate classification systems for categorizing potential victims based on age, physical appearance, and perceived spiritual qualities. They knew which regions produced the most attractive children, which bloodlines created individuals with desirable characteristics, and when each community would be ready for the next collection cycle. This wasn't random raiding or opportunistic warfare. This was systematic human procurement operating with the efficiency of a religious corporation, complete with supply chains, quality control measures, and distribution networks that ensured the right victims reached the appropriate ceremonies at precisely the correct times. Once selected, these individuals faced a journey that would transform them from human beings into sacred objects. They were immediately separated from their families and transported to specialized facilities where they underwent conditioning processes designed to prepare them for their ultimate purpose. The Aztecs had developed sophisticated techniques for psychological preparation that ensured victims would cooperate willingly in their own destruction. The conditioning began with isolation from anyone who spoke their native language or shared their cultural background. Victims were given new names that reflected their sacred status and forbidden from maintaining connections to their previous identities. Within weeks, most couldn't remember their birth names or the faces of their families. But the psychological manipulation went much deeper. The empire created environments where these traumatized individuals competed for the attention and approval of their captors, where survival depended on demonstrating enthusiasm for the religious roles they would eventually fulfill. The most successful learned to express gratitude for their selection, viewing their fate as divine privilege rather than victimization. The training facilities themselves were architectural marvels of cruel efficiency. Archaeological excavations have revealed compound structures designed specifically for processing large numbers of ritual candidates simultaneously. These facilities included dormitories, training areas, medical stations, and specialized chambers where victims underwent procedures designed to enhance their suitability for specific ceremonies. The medical aspects of victim preparation reveal the systematic nature of Aztec sexual exploitation. Priests worked with specialized practitioners who understood how to maintain physical health while implementing psychological conditioning. They developed dietary regimens designed to enhance physical appearance, herbal treatments to regulate reproductive cycles, and surgical procedures to modify bodies according to ceremonial requirements. As we conclude this examination of one of history's most disturbing chapters, we're left with uncomfortable truths about human nature, religious authority, and the capacity for systematic cruelty that exists within organized societies. The Aztec Empire's sexual practices weren't aberrations or temporary madness driven by warfare. They were calculated religious policies that operated with bureaucratic precision for centuries, affecting millions of lives and fundamentally shaping the development of Mesoamerican civilization. The most important lesson from this history isn't about any particular culture or belief system. It's about recognizing how religious institutions can corrupt the most sacred aspects of human experience when they operate without moral constraints. These patterns of exploitation don't disappear simply because we find them uncomfortable to discuss. They evolve, adapt, and find new expressions in each generation that abandons its responsibility to protect the vulnerable. The voices of those victims, preserved in the very codices that documented their suffering, demand to be remembered as warnings about what happens when societies transform human dignity into religious currency. Only by confronting these truths honestly can we hope to build civilizations where such systematic brutality becomes not just illegal, but literally unthinkable. Human dignity isn't negotiable, and that principle remains our best defense against the darkness that emerges when power operates without conscience.